what does Godzilla? So what does Godzilla stand for? Like, what's Godzilla mean? I've spent too much time recording and re-recording this to really sort of get into a situation where, like, boom, everything ends up being perfect. So I apologize if I speak very quickly and if I speak very unfocused. But you know what? I've kind of done a lot of it. So kind of done this a lot. So I'm gonna just go with that. So I watched King of the Monsters recently, and one of the big things that I want to talk about is I want to talk about exactly what Godzilla means. Like, what has he fundamentally sort of entailed? And that particular adverb is actually kind of a trick, kind of a trap, because Godzilla realistically has kind of not meant that much, really. And I'm going to talk about that. Now, let's talk about that. Okay, so when we're talking about Godzilla, we oftentimes talk about like the nuclear image, right? The nuclear message, the nuclear imagination. You know, that's something that Susan Napier talks about. That's something that William Tsutsui and Godzilla on My Mind talks about. That's something that Carol Gluck talks about. You know, if we want to talk about like the atom bomb, then we talk about Godzilla. And so, in some sense, we might intuitively say that Godzilla is about the atom bomb. And you know what? That's kind of true in some ways, but that's mainly true when we're talking about the original Ishiro Honda and Tanaka Tomoyuki Godzilla. You know, that's black and white film. It's very war film because originally it was supposed to be a war film, but after some political issues that were happening in Indonesia, it turns out that they weren't able to actually make the war film they wanted to make. And so Tanaka is essentially flying back, and he's trying to figure out a way to sell a sort of new idea to the bigwigs at Toho. And he comes up with Godzilla, which fundamentally is just a ripoff of the beast from the 20,000 Fathoms. There's a lot of questions that come about as to exactly where this Godzilla name came from. You know, some people say it's this build off of Kujira and Gorira. Some people say it's like a coworker, but it really kind of doesn't matter. So in this original film, you know, it's just Godzilla. So in this original film, it's just Godzilla. And you know what? This film is huge. About like 9 million people or so see the film in theaters, and that's an immense number. That's functionally at the time that that film came out, 1 in 10 Japanese people had seen the film. This wasn't a cult classic or something that then grew up to be big. No, this was big right out of the gate. And so it's really important as a result to consider that, you know, the challenges that Godzilla ultimately had to face after that, but also exactly like what it had to deal with. And what I mean by that is, okay, if it's talking about the nuclear message, what kind of nuclear message, what kind of war message, what kind of film is the original Godzilla? So I think in this case, I think we should probably start to talk about Casu Bravo. A lot of people know what Casu Bravo is. It's the detonation of nuclear bombs at the Bikini Atoll and so on and so forth. But first of all, it's not just one. There are multiple detonations. And as a result, I think it's really important to consider exactly why. Why is that the case? How is that important? And what does that necessarily mean in the context of Godzilla? So I think the easiest way to think about this is in the context of the battleship Nagato. So of the original battleships that came out at the onset of the Japanese-American War in World War II, the battleship Nagato was actually the only Japanese battleship that was left of those original, I think there were 10 of them or so. That was actually the original flagship of the Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. And while it didn't actually fight at Pearl Harbor, it did provide rear support as ships were fleeing. And therefore, as a result, there's a very specific imagination that's really important, and there's a very specific symbolic currency that the Nagato has. This is really important when we consider that when the Americans got to Tokyo Bay, the Nagato was there. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't in a very good sort of condition. It was barely seaworthy, and it had a very particular quirk about it. See, inside the Nagato were its crew members. They were dead, probably killed by airstrikes or conflict and so on and so forth. And thus, it was simply this ghost ship that was just languishing in Tokyo Bay. So the Americans, right, they find it, they keep it, they essentially patch it up. When I mean patch it up, I don't mean they fix it. I mean, they literally seal its insides and keep the bodies of the Japanese sailors in there. And so, as a result, here's a really important thing. They kept this ship alive. Not seaworthy, really, but alive. At least alive long enough to fulfill what they wanted to do, the Americans. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to sink the ship.
All right, what's the 12 Years a Slave of Hiroshima?
Well, I suppose on the Japanese side, it would be the first Godzilla movie, which was made in reaction in the aftermath of the hydrogen bomb testing in the Pacific, which resulted in the radiation poisoning of Japanese fishermen who were nearby the atolls. Godzilla is a nuclear monster, and all Japanese who saw that in the mid-50s, the original Godzilla, not the American Godzilla, they knew the references.
So where do they sink it? Well, they sink it at Bikini Atoll. So the initial bomb, Operation Able, they try and sink it, the initial bomb into Operation Able. Doesn't take. The ship survives, and for the most part, it's still alive. It's still seaworthy. It's still floating. It's still buoyant. So they say, okay, well, you know what? We're going to do it again. So they sink it at they sink it at the bomb Baker, and that's the famous one. You see the giant mushroom cloud with like the, and in the foreground you see the islands and the trees and so on and so forth. If you look at the column, you look at the water column that forms the mushroom cloud, and you look at the shape just to the left of the upright shape in the middle of the pillar, to that left you see this large silhouette. That's the Nagato. And what's even more important is that at the time of the detonation of the Nagato, it was full of dead Japanese sailors. And as a result, I think it's really important when we consider it in that particular context. When Akira Ikufube, the composer of the original Gojira films, and, the composer who would come back over and over again, when he says, Godzilla is the manifestation of Japan's war dead, that's kind of what they're referring to. They're referring to these people who essentially lost their lives and their meanings, and they're essentially these currencies of symbolic exchange. And what's even more so, they were used in such a particular way as this giant political middle finger, even more damningly in the context of the atom bomb at atomic nuclear detonation. And this atomic nuclear detonation is really important in the context of the Japanese, the only group thus far who has actually been nuked.
試合開始を宣言しました。さて、いかなる波乱を呼ぶか。今日の東京都体育館です。
So I want to skip a little bit now. So I want to make a little bit of a time skip here. Because let's go to April 1962. Okay, we got this tag team match, right? Japan versus America. We've got Riki Dozan, considered the father of modern Japanese pro wrestling. On the other hand, we've got Freddie Blassie. And, they've got this tag team match and televised. It's televised on TV. And it was huge. It's one of the things that kind of helped this promulgation of television. And so what do I mean by this? Well, television at this stage had been a huge force in Japan. It initially started off at the sort of like TV sort of central public spaces in which people might be able to like see things, and then it has a sort of weird common sort of juxtaposition. If you look at like the shots of Akira when they're moving past the TVs, or if you're looking at like say the opening of Persona 4, the animation, the TVs in the center of Shinjuku, there's a very particular imagination that's based upon the role of television in that context. But by this stage, right, NHK had already sufficiently developed a strong broadcasting network. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics were coming up. The marriage of Emperor Akihito to Empress Michiko was being televised. And we have on the airs pro wrestling. And pro wrestling played a huge role in regards to two things. One, the sensibilities of how we can kind of tell a story. We can make the claim that shonen anime and the way it thinks about like fighting and whatnot is itself an offshoot of early pro wrestling in Japan. And that's a really important element to consider. But there's also another one, and that is the effect on cinema. Because Japanese cinema essentially felt two major effects. One, externally, which is from Hollywood films that were essentially doing really well in Japan, and also French films that were doing really well in Japan. And then the other one, which is the internal one. And the internal challenge was television. And I think the easiest way to think about it is through Donald Ritchie. Donald Ritchie studies, of Japanese studies. He makes a really interesting claim, and that is that the greatest threat to Japanese cinema, it wasn't the earthquake, it wasn't the 1923 Kanto earthquake, it wasn't the war, it wasn't the dismantling of the imperialist government, it wasn't the Americans melting reels or what have you. It was television. Television, as a result, I think is really important in this context because at the same year, we have King Kong versus Godzilla. We have in 1954, Godzilla, the original film. And then the second one is Godzilla's counterattack in 1955. And then we have a complete quiet spell for 7 years. And out comes this film, Godzilla vs. King Kong. And this is actually Ishiro Honda's most financially successful film. This is the film that did it. It wasn't the original one with its 10% watch audience, and it wasn't the second one. It was this one, this seemingly innocuous and incredibly cheesy film between Godzilla and King Kong that really sort of solidified the kind of formula, because then we would have Godzilla versus Mothra, then we would have Monster Zero, then we would have Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, and we would essentially build the foundations for the Godzilla franchise to come. And this was fundamentally this idea about pro wrestling. Because look at it this way, if you're somebody who's developing films and you're part of the sort of Japanese cinema apparatus, what do you do against the pressures that are faced? On one hand, you might develop the sort of pink films, pinku-eiga, which are these, these sort of softcore and yet sometimes they're artistic films because, you can't really show that on television. Or on the other hand, you might do like these sort of violent and yet sort of interesting Yakuza films. But in the case of Ishiro Honda, maybe you adopt the elements of television. You adopt them for film. Now, Honda says that he does it satirically, but, I think it's really important to consider that particular pressure on Godzilla, because Godzilla, in this context, has changed radically and so quickly, and as such, it's really important to consider that particular dimension. So this brings up another question. Like, where does King of the Monsters therefore stand? Because I think when we're talking about King of the Monsters, is it a faithful Godzilla film? I think an atomic message is completely insufficient. I think when we're talking, because when we look at the atomic message, it's largely been very sort of unclear. And aside from the original 54 film, it's not really been engaged with that particularly well. And it can oftentimes kind of run afoul of sort of fan sentiments. For example, a lot of people malign the Roland Emmerich 98 Godzilla film. And for a lot of good reasons. It's pretty much Jurassic Park and it's pretty much Ferris Bueller meets Jurassic Park meets whatever. Really important to consider that Emmerich himself wasn't really a big fan of the Godzilla franchise anyway, so it was kind of visible. But yet, nevertheless, there is actually quite a robust atomic theme in the 98 film. Because remember, one of the things that they note is that, Godzilla is laying eggs like salmon, and they say that salmon always go back to the place of their birth. And it's kind of telling, therefore, that in that film, Godzilla goes back to Manhattan, goes to Manhattan, the place of their birth. As a result, that's a reference to the Manhattan Project. And, the idea that the film starts off with, like, these bomb detonations in French Polynesia, which is the closest way that they can reference Castle Bravo without incriminating American actions. And so there's all of these sorts of relationships that are thus at play in the 98 film, and these are very, very strictly atomic. But people really hated the film, and for really good reasons. And so as a result, I think it's really important to consider that Godzilla has not really been consistently about the atomic metaphor. So, what is Godzilla about? For the most part, I think Godzilla is simply just a franchise that has had to deal with the pressures of media affects upon Japanese cinema in a lot of different ways. And so its adaptation, it's having to deal with this adaptation, I think is what underlines Godzilla. If there is something that can underline Godzilla in the first place. And I think in this context, King of the Monsters really imbibes that idea of adaptation. It's such a fundamentally postmodern text in a lot of ways, in the context that there are so many elements in which people kind of pick and choose about the points of Godzilla that they find valuable, and then they reconstruct it into another sort of meaning-making kind of text. You know, the idea that Ghidorah is an alien, which is a reference to Monster Zero, and then there's the 91 film. There's the film, right, with Serizawa, he's detonating the WMD to revive Godzilla through nuclear energy, which itself is a mishmash. It's a sort of Jamesonian, complete collage. It's a pastiche of so many different things at once. The fact that they go down into the oceans is a similar scene to when they go down into the depths, and when they meet Godzilla and Serizawa meets Godzilla, detonates the bomb and says, "Goodbye, old friend," is actually a reference to, one, not only the 1954 version in which Serizawa sacrifices himself using the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla, but also in a lot of films where they have to revive the body. I think the way that makes the most sense is in the 91 film. There's this soldier, he leads this company. He's being attacked by the Americans. And then, he salutes Godzilla after Godzilla is very heavily wounded. And that's kind of like the B plot that runs. And then what ends up happening is at the end of the film, near the end of the film, Godzilla sees that soldier again. He's a salary man now. He sees Godzilla, and Godzilla's looking back at him. And then Godzilla just blasts the shit out of him. And so this is actually really important in this context because that particular action is very understanding of the sort of Godzilla franchise as a whole. You know, it was originally this war film, but then it was completely discombobulated and remade because Japan has a fundamentally different image of itself now. It's no longer a war state. Now it's a sort of economic state. That's why we have the salaryman visage. And this is actually a really important sort of passing of the baton in the context that Doherty is using it, because that's kind of what's happening in King of the Monsters. Serizawa's farewell to Godzilla is incredibly poignant when we consider it in the context of the 1954 film, that originally Serizawa sacrifices himself to stop Godzilla, and thus we have this bittersweet ending where Tokyo Bay is all destroyed. And yet, at the same time, in this new film, it's completely different. The whole relationship is completely different.